Everyone. The topic of the session is liberating your teams from rigid scope and date agreements. So I'm Rowan Bunning, and this is a session that has kind of two parts to it. So the first part is to do with something called the contract game. And this is something that Craig Larman has articulated in quite a lot of talks over the years. Is anyone familiar with that? Has anyone kind of come across that before? Maybe you want to do a reaction if you have come across the contract game. Not saying that. No? Okay. It does require a little bit of explanation, and that's just the first maybe third or quarter of this session. And then I want to get into the juicy bit, which is a lot of thoughts about how we can work on eliminating this rather problematic contract game situation that we often find ourselves in. So yeah, probably won't say too much about myself. I think a few of you know me, but I do quite a lot of Scrum training. And also, yeah, part of what's inspiring this, I guess, is a lot of discussion in the LESS community. So large scale Scrum or LESS. And yeah, LESS actually has a aim of actually eliminating the contract game. So it's very much related to what we're talking about tonight here. And thank you to Baz Vode as well for some of his thoughts about techniques and approaches to moving past this scope and date kind of game that we find ourselves playing. All right, so just a quick outline of the contract game to start with. And this uses a little bit of very, very basic game theory. And I guess the insight that I found really interesting is having experienced a lot of situations where there was some rigidity about scope and there was a fixed date in lots of projects, particularly, that this part of the Agile Manifesto, something we've all probably seen, really relates to not just contracts with external parties or any legal contracts, but actually very much what we're talking about tonight, internally within your organization. How do stakeholders and the development group actually engage? How is control exerted, and how does that relationship work? So this is just a very high level of the fact that in lots of organizations, we have business people who may have some business opportunity or some need that might relate to dealing with external customers or external interests. And the external contract, if there is one, is not the subject of what we're talking about with the contract game. It's great if you can make that more flexible, but we can potentially work with fairly fixed external contracts. The real question is, how do business stakeholders, particularly the person or people who have that external contract or that customer problem on their shoulders, that need, actually engage with the development group when they need something developed, some product development, some project work in order to fulfill the need. So that's what we'll call the internal contract, is the agreement that's reached between the business people and development. The way this normally gets started is the two players, the business and development. The names could be different, right? It could be product management and R&D in some organizations, and I've had that in some I've worked with. And at the start, I guess the business is seeking to negotiate a certain amount of deliverable or certain scope to what they get for perhaps a certain spend. And there's a date perhaps involved there as well. And the general interests from the business side of things, more. They generally want more scope by a shorter date if possible. And development normally see a bit of risk coming, so want a little less scope by perhaps a longer timeline to deal with that. Yeah, the agreement, or the contract, we'll call it, is really something like a sign-off or something like a agreement of some sort. And I've certainly seen it very heavily emphasized in government projects, for example, when you've got an external vendor, but this is even internal to your company. So, you know, if you've got internal stakeholders and perhaps a sponsor who's paying for it, it might be what they actually finalize with some representatives from the development group. And it's kind of arbitrary when that happens. There can be negotiation that sort of drags on for weeks, months, even years potentially to get to that point. But normally from that point, there's a clock ticking down to the date that's been agreed. The kind of problem really comes up when once that's been agreed, the business people involved feel that they've made their big move. They've got development to agree to something, some deliverables by a date. And now they perhaps shift the responsibility to development to deliver on that. So you agree to it, so we now expect you to fulfill that agreement. And in doing so, business people are losing control over the situation. There's less flexibility about actually optimizing the value or changing direction when more is learned. There's often lower transparency because things become more technical, and often people are trying to break it down into what's efficient to execute on or to deliver, rather than keep things nice and visible for the stakeholders. By the way, that might help if you haven't seen me so big with the slides. Another issue is, it's normally done as a big batch, especially in a project environment and big programs of work and things like that. It's often signed up as one big thing that could be taking more than a year, or maybe a quarter at the very least. And it's kind of not all or nothing. Nothing's really available until the end. So when it gets shifted to development to deliver on, there's often a need then to keep on track to actually deliver what we said we would by that date. And that's where tracking to plan behavior comes in, where we need, and people often get overly concerned about velocity and burn down or burn up charts. And, it's really not the real value that we're looking at there. It's real abstractions away from that we're tracking to see, are we delivering what we said we would? And the focus, it's a bit like saying our focus is just to deliver what was agreed at the early stage, way back when we agreed it, rather than looking to the future and saying, let's actually get the best product, the most valuable outcome out of this, given what we learned along the way. Excuse me if this video is a little bit out of focus. There we go. So potentially if you've got different people involved in the chain from the developer to the perhaps sponsor or main customer, I'll just outline this very briefly because you probably know the drill. Things often get watered down, let's say. The developer thinks it's a big mess, but people in between are trying, because they're incentivized to make it sound a little more rosy, a little less problematic, till the business person really hears that it's all fine. And this is my favorite deal bit to do with this. I'll let you have a quick look, but really summarizes the situation where it's not really transparent, right? The situation is when we find that things are not progressing well. It's perhaps done in terms of status reports. If you've heard the joke about the green on the outside, red on the inside, like a watermelon, this is often what's going on, where people try to keep it looking green for as late as possible until it's actually not possible to keep the good news, and then it's all red. So and the business people perhaps can't really see what that means in terms of actual features or major capabilities coming through, because again, we're all just doing that on the development side, and they're not so involved perhaps in steering it. So a lot of what we're talking about relates to valuing responding to change, or behaviors that relate to, following a plan, over responding to change in that instance. And we've basically got the setup that we need to keep tracking things relative to that agreement, that contract, rather than take advantage of the reality that presents itself in terms of how fast we can get through things, and even what the better and more valuable things are that emerge. And because the business said more, and a more aggressive deadline, thank you very much, if they can negotiate that, and development was saying less, basically what was going on there from the very start was a competitive game. So both parties had differing interests, and both parties were trying to push the other party to the edge of, what could be agreed to, essentially. So in other words, as a developer or development people might feel like they were under pressure to add more scope than they were really comfortable with to that agreement and have a more aggressive date than they were comfortable with. So what that means is that we've basically maximized the potential for people to blame the other party when things go wrong and say, well, you put us under pressure, you pretty much had us and pushed us to take on more than we could take on. So, is it any wonder that we can't get through it all on time? So when things do go wrong, and you can expect that they will, in terms of tracking to a pretty fixed and detailed plan, if you are doing that in a complex environment, there'll be surprises. That's the nature of a complex environment. There's unknown unknowns. And it's a question of, what do we do? How do we deal with that? And how does that affect the relationship? So yeah, business people might say, well, if it gets near the end and there's been a surprise from development, business people might say, you've committed, so you should be able to deal with it. It's your problem at your end. And just saying the word committed or saying you deal with it doesn't just have that problem go away, or the intrinsic variability perhaps we've been dealing with and its uncertainty go away. And so, yeah, it's that blame game that can ensue. So what does development do? I've seen this, I've seen colleagues do this, and I've probably done it myself. Work long hours, right? Definitely remember that, especially pre-Agile, certain death march type of situations over time. No longer thinking about the design. We don't put as much thought and love into it. We don't have time to. Poor quality code, we'll be cutting corners, not cleaning things up. That'll be called technical debt later on. Not talking, taking time to learn. We're not perhaps putting all the effort and time into our retrospectives. Maybe people say, let's not even do them. Stopping testing or doing less testing, so we don't even find the defects, external defects, and of course internal quality issues because we're not cleaning the code up and perhaps even learning about what's going on in the code base as much. We don't have time for that. Yeah, and broader weaknesses in the organization just aren't being addressed, right? When you're just under the pump and trying to deliver. And the longer term consequences, I think these are the ones to talk to managers and stakeholders about and try to kind of get some shared interest in these things. If we work overtime and people feel under pressure constantly, then you can expect the best to leave. People that can find a job elsewhere will. Lots of technical debt, total cost of ownership, and in some cases it ends up being rewritten, right? Because it becomes so difficult to work with that we have to start again. By the way, if anyone's got any questions or thoughts as we go, do feel free to pop them in the chat. I meant to invite that as we go today. And in a moment, I'll do a couple polls with you to see, how are you going with all this? Yeah, definitely distrust, right? Because that whole blame game thing of you committed, you didn't deliver on your commitment, and people saying, well, okay, you put us under pressure to take on more than we could chew. And in some organizations, they might outsource the problem. I probably won't spend too much on this. I just want to say that you can look at this in terms of the short-term fix that people have put in to use this secret toolbox to cut the corners. Does in the short term look like it's actually achieving results, right? We get more new features by people doing that, perhaps. This is the whole idea of, well, perhaps intentionally taking on technical debt and cutting corners just to get something out. But of course, in the longer term, and that's really the big trap, it has a very unhealthy, detrimental effect on your code base. It has a detrimental effect on morale and investment in improvement, and really people not having time to keep things improving, keep things thriving, keep things continuously going forward. So yeah, it can lead people to do more of it. Ultimately, Agile is not meant to be like this. That's the big point, right? That setting the scene for a good Agile environment is about moving away from a competitive game where business and development set the stage to actually blame each other later on when things don't work out, and move into a cooperative game. And there's a big hint about that in the Agile Manifesto, as well as the book by Alistair Coburn, which was subtitled The Cooperative Game. And yeah, these principles perhaps relate to it as well. Ability to harness change, really have the customer involved in that. So I just want to check in with you, because I know that's a fair bit of talking there just to set the scene, but I just want to see how familiar to you is this sort of thing? Maybe even check if my audio video is okay. Can anyone give me a thumbs up if I'm still audible and still going okay? Yeah, Peter, good, okay. So you should see a little poll there, just a gut feel of what I've described, right? That setup of negotiating a fixed scope and date, and then, perhaps having business disengage somewhat and say, we'll see you when it's delivered, largely, I guess, especially the sponsor and senior stakeholders. Yeah, to what extent have you seen that? Okay, this is interesting. We got a fairly mixed response here, but it's good to know. But it does look like the majority of us have seen this most of the time, if not all. All right, so I might just pause that there. And can you see the results popping up? Yeah. Yeah, right. So I've seen this a lot, especially in project environments, I guess. It seems like a lot of the initiation of projects involves essentially starting up a contract game-like environment. But I've also seen other environments where it just wasn't like that. And yeah, maybe I can refer to them a little bit as we look at some techniques for moving past this and perhaps eliminating the contract game in favor of something that's more conducive to good Agile. Now, I've got no less than 11 things listed there. It's a lot. And in some versions of this talk, I just recorded 7 because perhaps the last ones were just a little bit more than people could handle and I had time for. I'm curious tonight just to see which ones sound most interesting. So we might just focus our time on the ones that are of most interest to you. Hopefully some of them are fairly straightforward, like educate about the contract game. Like it's pretty much the sort of thing I was just talking about, but maybe helping people understand that in different forums and appreciate the cost of playing the game that way, and alternatives to it, I guess, is the big one. Educate about product development, especially stakeholders who themselves have not really been in development roles and perhaps not so familiar with some of the uncertainty and trade-offs and things. Make releases more frequent. I think that can have a positive effect in multiple ways on this. We can talk about that because it's perhaps not quite as obvious as it might first seem. Focus on impacts, not outputs. So rather than fixating on a fixed scope in terms of deliverables, looking at some measurement of the impact that's having for your business. This could be real return on investment, real product metrics, for example. Shift from timelines to trends. So instead of saying, let's track progress versus some baseline plan or some initial scope and date, let's look at what the trending says about what's likely in the future based on how we're rolling. And move the product owner role to the external contract owner. So remember that person at the start there that had that external, perhaps customer relationship and business problem that they wanted to take that opportunity to fulfill. Could they steer directly? That's what I've seen work beautifully well in some organizations. That is often more senior product owner and someone who's really a high level of authority. And separate development from external commitments. That's probably a really core one, to really have the development group work at a sustainable pace, genuinely nice and healthy, sustainable pace, and not be under pressure and as a result, cutting corners. Remove project management. It's pretty blunt, but in some setups, we can have the business steer directly, and very much in the model of Scrum, not be wrapping that with separate start-stop projects that might otherwise tend to fix the scope of that project and tend to set up this dynamic in the first place. Expand the product definition. That one's really relevant if you have other groups in the organization who say we need a time commitment as to when X is going to be available because we need to do something with it, deploy it, market it, support it, whatever it is, right? There's often other departments or different functional groups that want to know when things are going to come through. So there's one possibility, it's the only one, but expand the product definition will tend to help with that. And restructure to feature teams can help, especially if you've got timings that needed to be planned for, because your overall system or overall product requires different components to be produced, and the APIs all stitched together and everything work to have it all in place. The final one, adopt less, is a very straightforward one. It's just basically saying less is an approach, not the only approach, and certainly not the only way, but one way that you can look at a set of patterns to actually address pretty much all of these, although some of them require, extra effort to actually have them happen, of course. So a lot of things there. Let me see if I can ask you which ones are of most interest and see how this works as an experiment tonight. And I think with this, you can say not at all interested, moderately interested, very interested. Let's see if we, just do a quick click through that if you can. Bit of an experiment, even how that works. You can tell me if you find it confusing, but hopefully it gives us some useful information in a moment. Wow. I've got some cool color coding going on I'm trying to make sense of. All right. I see, right. So I've got this light blue for very interested, purple for moderately interested, and this orange for not at all interested. Interesting. Okay. Shift from timelines to trends seems to be the number one. Wow. Capture of this in a moment. And what else? Looks like focus on impacts on outputs. I have varied amounts of material on these ones, but all of the slides I can make available to you, so you can check out anything we don't go into so much this time. All right. If you haven't submitted it, let's see if you can finish that up. All right, 3, 2, 1. There we go. I might see if I can give myself a little recording of that as well. All right, can you see that now? Share results, there it is. So yeah, those ones on the left of the light blue is the ones that were most popular. And yeah, if it's got lots of orange, it wasn't so popular, I guess. All right. Let's try a few of them until maybe you might just go until about 20 past and then take a pause and see what you think. Because I'm happy to just chat about them a bit more informally too, interactively on this meetup. I think that'll make a lot of sense as well. All right, let's jump in. I'll jump to the timelines not trends one, see what happens there. And like I say, I'm not suggesting that these slides are comprehensive about all of them. It's just a few starting point thoughts. But yeah, this one probably starts with this sort of situation with the product backlog is one way of looking at a pull-based way to pull work into progress rather than pushing out activities over a timeline. So I like to use that to help people understand how Scrum-based planning, for one thing, is meant to be different from traditional planning, where we might say, let's actually define what we're going to be doing in June, what's going to be delivered by the end of August, etc. And you see that, and often it looks like a Gantt chart, whether it's a product roadmap or something else, as there's actually activities or milestones associated with dates in the future. So that's what a lot of stakeholders expect. And I totally understand, how that comes into play from the start. One of the things I think for us to really work at, though, is to create a different view of what's going on, which is more a queue that we'll pull from. And the queue may or may not be called a product backlog, but that's certainly a very popular way to do it. Where this succeeds or fails, though, is the degree to which that queue is visible and understood. And one of the accountabilities I've got straight there with the product owner role is to ensure that the product backlog is transparent, visible, and understood. And I guess I often ask questions of people, do your high interest stakeholders, the ones that are asking, what they can expect in the future and perhaps have things to say about what's coming up, do they know where to find the product backlog? If they do they understand what's on there? Can they see the things of interest to them? If not, then we can't really show them. We're not actually having transparency over really what's the Agile style of plan that we've got at the moment. Now, there's a little bit more to it than that, of course. Another one is, this question. Who's got this question coming up? When is X going to be delivered? Does that sound like a pretty common thing for stakeholders to want to ask about? Yeah, the feature, the release, a big juicy thing that they're interested in. Yeah, the thing I'd suggest is, instead of saying, we're going to give you a fixed date on that, instead starting by, let's have a look at where that is in the queue, and get the context of where that is relative to everything else. And when they say, all right, that's a bit too abstract, I need to understand, is that likely this month, next month, between 2 and 3 months out, or what is that? Looking at the trends, looking at some sort of projections based on things like the pace that we're getting through the current work, and also doing that as a range, because it's not a perfectly precise thing to say, it'll be exactly this day or date, especially with things that are further out in the timeline and then time horizon or further down the backlog. So we want to be able to project that out in a time frame to say it's probable between this time and that time, and also people can see what sort of things are ahead of it and what sort of decisions are on the table that may or may not affect that. So yeah, it's a more nuanced answer, but it's one where also that's a two-way thing, right? If there are specific business events or dates that a person in that product owner capacity should be aware of, because it makes a big difference, like there's a huge amount of drop off in value, or there's some urgency to achieve it by a certain date, then that can be taken into account, of course, and perhaps a case made to push that a bit higher on the queue. And yeah, things I find useful. So with I guess a multi-sprint or multi-iteration release, on the left we have a burn down chart just off a training course where I think that the participants said they forgot to say no, right? They just kept on adding more stuff to the scope, but at least they could see the impact of that, right? By projecting out that scope change line at the bottom of those bars, as well as the sort of velocity line. And I would tend to, in real life at work, project out a range instead of that. It's a single dotted line at the top there, of course. That's great if you're going for like one first release perhaps, or a high stakes one, and there's multiple sprints to it. It's like landing it. It's got a landing it sort of metaphor. But if you're releasing frequently, then burn up chart would be an alternative. And you see an example on the right hand side where it is giving you that range, right? The optimistic, pessimistic, and we're projecting things out. And I've done this with backlogs where it's not just projecting out everything or projecting out one release, but even taking like large things. I'm trying not to say the word epic, but large things that we might be working through, and projecting this one out versus that one, and giving an updated answer every sprint is part of the idea here, right? So it's not just a fixed projection 6 months out and then you hear nothing. Every sprint we'll be updating this. So yeah, the sort of questions I think that are kind of game changing here for Scrum Masters, coaches, all of us to be asking, what would it take for the product backlog to be sufficiently transparent to stakeholders that they don't require a time-based plan? Like, how much work do we need to put into that, and articulate those backlog items in meaningful ways, make them more findable, really sit down and help those people navigate it and make sense of it, or have projections that we can always point to and be able to see it at any point in time. What will it take to shift the conversation from how much we've delivered to how the product's shaping up? So I think there's a big paradigm shift conversation there about, instead of going, well, how are we tracking versus a certain fixed scope and a fixed date, It's how's the product shaping up towards being successful, or the sort of value we're seeking, and can we even start to measure that value? Have we done some releases that can, if we're trying to get it to 10% uplift of some metric, can we get to 5%? And how's that tracking? So that relates to one of the other approaches, which is to focus on outcomes for users and impacts for the business rather than just outputs. And what would it take to be confident enough to let requirements emerge as we go? So I think this is one of the lines that people skim over in the Agile Manifesto too. The best requirements is part of it, right? Emerge from self-organizing teams, or to elaborate that, self-organizing teams working directly with business people, like users, subject matter experts, customers directly, things like that. When that's a belief that if we actually let that information really percolate and work that through as we go, we'll actually end up with something that's more on the mark than if we don't. We'll actually be able to take advantage of feedback, learning, all that sort of thing. So yeah, that's one of the questions for people too, is do we believe that, and are we willing to pursue that? So any questions or thoughts at this stage? Anyone want to jump in? Because I know I'm just rambling on about that one. Some of you are live here and curious as to what you're thinking at the moment. Otherwise, I'll just jump into this one and then pause and see what you think. Impacts, not outputs. So this is something I talk about quite a lot with product owners. And I think it's a really different framing from the start, right? To avoid these sort of smells, right? So you look at your classic Gantt chart. This is a rather horrible example where it has sprints in it and seems to, we're partway through sprint 2, yet we've actually planned what's going to be in sprint 3 before we've even arrived at sprint 3. So this is a very much, if you look at this versus the Agile Manifesto, this is following a plan behavior. And often people get into this, I think, because there is a contract game in play that we have made a commitment to a fixed scope or a fixed date, and therefore we're trying to figure out, well, how many things we have to get through this sprint, next sprint, et cetera, to achieve that. And really, the Agile side of things just starts to become more and more fictitious at that point, right? We're kind of just using Agile buzzwords to do what we always did with a Gantt chart, with a predictive project plan. Yeah, again, I think a lot of product roadmaps or just roadmaps I've seen tend to have the same overall effect. They might be prettier, they might be slightly higher level, but I think this is an example from some Atlassian tool just I found on the web. Yeah, they're doing something which is relating specific features or specific backlog to dates. So it's not a pool-based way of planning and then projection. It's a push-based way, right? We're pushing specific deliverables across dates. And again, you'd be keeping on track. It's a following the plan behavior that I'd expect this would encourage as well. So yeah, one of the big hints that Scrum now has is the product goal. So we don't just have a sprint goal, we have a product goal in the latest Scrum guide. And that is best done as something that's not just about outputs and saying deliver these 27 features. It's about measuring the impact of stuff that's already delivered, so that maybe we could release many times over and actually track that metric or measurable outcomes for users. I use that term for users. So this is the way people can have a different experience versus impact for the business, which might be specific things like increasing transactions or saving money or customer satisfaction, potentially things like that. So yeah, one of the cool things with that is you can actually have a way of showing a dial or some sort of graphical thing. I almost put one up here, but yeah, be able to track progress relative to that. And one thing I find a nice starting point for this is, instead of a feature-oriented roadmap or one that fixes the scope to the dates, have a goal-oriented roadmap, which is really just articulating a set of incremental goals, maybe just 2 or 3 goals, where the ones further out are a bit fuzzier and going to be revised as we get closer. but this helps to sort of take the focus away from the features, and the deliverables are just a means to the ends of something much more important, which is the measurable impact. So that's that third row and that fifth row, I guess, there. Actually, here's my visual trying to articulate what this could look like. And I think I haven't seen enough of it for sprint goals either, but I'd love to see dials on a sprint backlog, every day going, can we measure some leading indicator sort of metric that shows that we're actually achieving some outcome, some why behind our sprint. Maybe we're cutting them out of time to sign up as a new customer. Can we measure that, right, as we go during the sprint? Whereas at the product goal level, it might be something which is in action out in the live environment, real world, and we can actually see it ticking up as we do more and more releases towards that. So that to me is a much more significant way to track progress and to look at things rather than exactly which features are to be delivered and are they the ones that we set at the start, because hopefully we can do better than that in an agile environment. So yeah, simplicity and maximizing the amount of work not done. So a lot of this is being better targeted rather than just doing the 27 features, finding out that half of them weren't used. We're trying to really focus it on the payoff. And yeah, that's the conversation I think that's much more powerful to have with stakeholders, to be able to say, hey, you're asking the question, well, when is this going to be delivered? Well, we've already been out producing part of it, and it's actually achieved a 5% uplift in customers converting to paying customers. We're up to 10%, but we've got evidence that we've got to 5% already. So we want to work with you to figure out how to get it from 5% to 10%. Now, what on the backlog can we focus efforts on to achieve that? Any thoughts or questions? Is this what you expect or a little different?
Rowan, it's Richard.
Yeah, hi.
I'm still wondering how that appeases the desire for a contract, though. I mean, that's a difficult conversation to pivot and introduce all of those suggestions from a mindset of, we're going to hold you to a contract. People are still incentivized by having a certain thing by a certain date for a certain cost.
Yeah.
How do you go about changing that mindset from the contract to the one that's open to the suggestions in your list?
Yeah, thanks. Really good question. I guess probably the one ultimate biggest move, if I could put it out there, that I've experienced is basically a lot of the reason we have this contract game in the first place is this intermediary relationship between the real business person who has the business problem, let's say, who has the need, the sponsor, let's say, and development. And often when we set up projects and we have project managers in between or another parties in between, the control is exercised by having contract game dynamics, I guess, in between there. But it's a massively different thing if you say the person who has that overall business opportunity, the whole sponsor perhaps level, potentially, it depends on your organization and whether they can delegate that perhaps to someone pretty directly involved with them to be able to play this. But yeah, I've had people like executives even playing the product owner role. And for them, I remember one of them who was like the business owner of a new online business venture within a broader media company. When I asked him, do you need to negotiate an agreement about the date and the scope with someone? And he said back to me, Rowan, if I was to do that, it would be with myself, because I'm the one that's actually steering that, making trade-off decisions every 2 weeks. I don't need to sign anyone else up to that because I'm doing that directly. And yeah, that just changed the whole game around this whole conversation. Everything we're talking about, I think, just becomes much less an issue when you've got that set up. Does that make sense, by the way? It might seem a bit ideal world, but...
Yeah, that is a bit ideal world. And we're lucky to find environments like that, but the majority of the time, large corporate banks or insurers that doesn't actually quite happen. There's a large raft of senior executives who have a vested interest in a certain thing by a certain date, and the willingness to have a conversation to move to this world is a hard slog. But that's what we're here for, and that's what we do. But I mean, you know this as well as I do. We've all been there. Moving away from the contract game, starting that conversation with willing people is quite hard.
It can be, yeah, definitely in some of those environments. I think the piece, well, there's multiple pieces that you might need to come together, but one of them I'll flick to next is just having people more aware of the consequences of persisting with that game versus maybe what they're now asking for,
Sure.
Flexibility, agility, some sort of actual outcomes.
I can see the most valuable piece for me here would be the awareness of the contract game, making them aware explicitly of what's really going on might open the conversation a bit easier.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe a few tips on that. Yeah, I think that the awareness is the first piece. Like a lot of things, like just being aware of something. If you're interested in change, like people aren't even aware of the possibility for something better, then yeah, you're not going to get very far with, you know, pushing a solution on people. Like just look at the burn down charts. Don't look at we don't have kind of date and scope plan anymore. So yeah, there's this talk, I guess, around, but yeah, Craig Larman does a great job of articulating the contract game in segments of his keynotes. You can find a bunch of them on YouTube. There's even a link to one of them there that I often point people to. This book, the second book by Craig and Baz, has a whole section on the contract game dynamics and, you know, ways to kind of get past that. I guess they're a big theme of a lot of the product management part of that book. And I think it can even go to some deeper beliefs, and maybe there's some Socratic method we can use with people here if we get fancy, to sort of, you know, probe what's beneath the surface there. Because ultimately, if you think about asking, you know, what do you really want from the capability with your development organization, right? Maybe you don't have to start with. And if people actually want flexibility, want adaptiveness around what's produced when, as in agility, then these two things could be on a collision course. You're asking for agility, yet you're wanting to continue with fixed scope, fixed date, low flexibility, low agility. Wait a sec, which one is it? And maybe, well, where do we put, you know, we're in that trade-off spectrum, and how much flexibility, how much agility we're going for. So we're not on the same page about that, then, you know, I've often found like agile coaches and such stakeholders could be at cross purposes, right? We're trying to implement something that they don't even think they want, or they hear the buzzwords and they think they can get the benefits without actually changing the way we're setting this up, which is not the case. Does that make sense? I think that's the conversation we kind of need to get to.
Yeah, that's fine. Thanks, Ron.
Great, lots of questions coming in now. Yeah, refiling fixed timelines. Oh, Nikita, are you there? Did you want to jump in now?
Hi, Rowan. Hey, yeah. My question is just regarding the fixed timelines. So if you're working in an agile environment per se, but you've still got fixed timelines, which you already mentioned, my question is just around how would you navigate the conversation with those stakeholders, especially your executives, and bring them on board, helping them understand that, hey, fixed timelines aren't really part of, say, being agile. So like, I'm just trying to understand how one would go about that.
Yeah, thanks. So it's one thing that's not, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's a potential for false dichotomies here. Like what I'm saying is, it's not a case of no timeline. Yeah, it's the fixing of very specific outputs, deliverables to that timeline without the expectation that will change, which is one possible way to kind of start with a, you know, possible allocation of outputs to a timeline. If we expect it to change and there's a low cost of change, then that may be less problematic. And the people, and what you find in reality with a lot of projects that sort of try doing this, they end up having to drop scope very rapidly towards the end when they find it's just not possible to get through all that scope by that timeline anyway. Does that make sense? But what we're trying to do that is take that attitude from the start, that every plan stands to be bettered, right? So, especially if you're on this journey, so maybe more sort of nuanced answer to what we were just talking about a second ago too, can be to, be starting with this thinking and really saying, do we believe that we are best placed to strive to better this plan and to change this plan when we find that there's either more valuable things to be doing or that this plan is actually not realistic, it's not true to reality of what's actually achievable given our capability.
Yeah.
Buy into that, then you got the starts to be able to move from where you are now with that sort of scope and date plan, maybe towards something that's more flexible. But as you do that, using those as real opportunities, I think those examples of when we needed to change a plan because either one of those two things were true, right? Either was no longer the most valuable thing to be doing, or it just wasn't realistic to be getting through at that rate. It was just overly optimistic. It was a fiction kind of thing. And now you can use those examples of maybe we can manage this differently in the future, right? What's the real examples of why bother to change that to make it a bit more flexible. I guess the other short answer is to say that you might have fixed times in terms of releases or dates by which things are going to be released, but the scope within those time periods is meant to flex or should be more flexible. Yeah.
No, thank you for that.
No worries. Yeah. And that's often a situation product owners find themselves in, right? They've got a fixed budget, fixed time, a lot of setups, but they're trying to optimize the value that is produced from that. I'm not saying that's optimal. Like if you talk about picking the optimal return on investment, you may be undercooking or overcooking it just because of that limited time and budget that might have been too little or sometimes too loose even. And we probably could have been moving on to something else. And that's part of what you can start to shine the light on as a coach, perhaps even to say, look at what we could do if we were to have a bit more flexibility around this. Someone else has got a question about if you're a vendor delivering a service. Do you want to chat about that and help us understand that?
Hello. Yes.
Yeah.
What if you are a vendor and you're delivering a service with a fixed time, fixed price, fixed everything, as we might know? How do you navigate that, knowing you're external to the organization and there's a procurement layer that might be rigid in the middle?
Yes, I hear you. Yeah, the first 3 organizations I did Agile stuff with we were always the vendor to an external client, and the client was paying the money for it. So the real game changer there is to set up the product ownership to be with the client organization. So the vendor might be in this very sketchy diagram on the behind me, people over this side, right, doing the actual development. Maybe the Scrum Masters and others might be with them even. But the person who might be paying for it on the client side is actually taking the steering wheel and steering directly to make scope and date trade-offs themselves. And that really changes the game around where the perceived risk is going on. Instead of shifting it all to the development group or the vendor, once they sign that agreement and say you must deliver this by X, like with a fixed price contract, then we've got a more shared risk, shared reward setup, which is more conducive to a partnership, a collaborative partnership. And it means there's more flexibility for the client, right? They can actually get different things that actually they think of and learn about later on, rather than having to spend ages trying to get everything they want into that big agreement up front and finding out some of that was waste. So yeah, what I'm saying is going to impact your procurement people in terms of the style of contract that actually reflects that. So interested in that, there's some really good resources around these days there's the starting point for a lot of them is target cost contracting. I don't know if you've heard of that, but it's an alternative to fixed price or time and materials, where there might be a target cost, but there's a sharing of overruns and a sharing of underruns, essentially.
Okay.
And yeah, Jeff Sutherland actually has this variant of it called money for nothing, change for free. It's like a Dire Straits song. But if you look up that and not put on the end of it, Agile contracts, you'll get a few things. But probably the best website is agilecontracts.org that I can think of right now. There's other ones around, but that one's related to what we're talking about here, because one of the authors of the Agile Contracts Primer is Craig Larman, who's the one that came up with the contract game.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I might just take a few more minutes and see, has anyone got another question or a preference for what we dip into next you want to call out? How about just have a quick look through what else we voted on before. I got a screen capture of it, and here we go. So share my screen on this. Maybe I can. Sorry, 1 sec. You see that? Yeah. Okay. What else did we get lots of votes for? It was yeah, impacts and outputs, shift from timelines to trends. We've done those. Educate about product development a little bit, but yeah, we haven't really talked about that. And look, I don't have a lot on educate about product development. I think there's a lot of things that can be said about that, but it's kind of trying to help people understand where there is. It's quite different from a lot of things that business people, if they've worked in operational lines of business, for example, what they've been managing for years and years is very different from product development. Let me just share 1 or 2 thoughts and see what you think. Maybe some of you got other ways to articulate this that I haven't got here. Let's have a look. Yeah, so which do stakeholders believe we're doing? Which is more like, is it more like, actually, what's going on outside my window today was very much like what's on the left, was new footpaths going out down outside my house, right? So they're actually laying concrete. They're literally putting concrete down outside my place and trailing it flat and all sorts of things. Or is it more like design, right? So if you're thinking of grand designs, for example, is it more like, laying the bricks and putting up the scaffolding and putting the roof on and things? Or is it more like doing the initial drawings and the concept drawing and the plans and changing them, and probably changing them even during the build of its grand designs, right? I think there's far too much thinking that product development is a bit more like building, especially if we use that term building. I tend not to say building if I can avoid it. I use the word development partly for this reason, that it's very different from building a physical building where you've already planned it or already designed it, and you're just executing on a pretty fixed and stable design, where instead we're problem solving, and every bit of, even down to the code, lines of code, is design. There's problem solving and design work in all of that. I think part of it too is to have people understand that when we do estimates, they're not actually commitments. Those are 2 different things. So a lot of times we end up in this contract game situation. It's taking what development was trying to express as an estimate and saying there's risk and uncertainty about this, things could go, either way to a fair degree, and saying, well, you committed to a very specific thing when that wasn't the intent. And it was, I've heard people, so maybe a real example, I heard some colleagues do this with some executives where they were trying to tie down my colleague to a specific date and budget. And with the budget piece of it, that my colleague said, our best guess is, and he was in pounds, 3 million pounds. Okay. And they asked him again, can you commit to that? And he said, our best guess is £3 million. And every time he said that, he would say, here's the variables, here's the things that we just don't know and can't possibly know at this point without doing part of the work. And after about 15 times of saying our best guess is, one of the executives finally said, oh, I think we get what you're saying here. You're saying that there's some risk and variability in this that just can't be gotten rid of until we get further into it. And we as executives need to actually take on that risk and understand it and manage it, or walk away from this. And he said, yes, thank you. That's really the understanding I need here. So yeah, I think that's the hard conversation, isn't it? But that's one way to try to get across, hey, this isn't, especially we're talking about a certain fairly fixed set of scope, something that we can fix as well as dates. We can't fix everything. So we're going to need some of it to be managed interactively to make the best of it. Maybe a quick final thing. I think a lot of models I've seen where the contract game's been a big thing and people have got a baseline plan or got a sort of fixed scope in mind at least and a date. What you end up doing is doing what might sound like sprints. We're going through the motions of iterative development, but is actually just incrementally building out a fixed scope. And that's not actually Scrum, really. That's not really empirical management of things. It's just fixed incremental delivery. There's something else called evolutionary delivery is a different term for it, but you could call it the empirical approach. And it's really a vigorous attempt to capture feedback in order to decide what to do next, rather than just to keep incrementally building out a fixed set of things that you already know about. Okay, so again, it's like, which model are we thinking about when we think of Agile or how we're setting this up? And I guess here are the questions. Maybe there's some more actionable things just to either think about yourself or start asking people. Yeah, what's the mental model we have of what sort of work we're doing here? Is it more like construction or is it more like the design? Do we think that we're going to do best when the product management, it's really just for Agile is just applied to the delivery teams, or is it when it's actually taken on by stakeholders as well? Like they play the game as well? Because that could be more beneficial. If so, what can we do to make that happen so they can actually be collaborative, right? The customer collaboration over contract negotiation. And which are we more interested in? Delivering what was agreed to on time and a budget, but not realizing the benefits quite so much, maybe not even sufficient to make it worthwhile. That would be perhaps a pretty unfortunate case, but it's certainly not as much benefit as actually discovering the right content of the product and how to create it to really strive for that maximum achievable return on investment, given the capacity we actually had and the learning we could do. So, and it all relies on people taking to heart that we have uncertainty, that we don't know it all up front. If they don't believe that, then how can we be Agile, and why are we trying to be Agile? Does that make sense? That's hopefully helping. How about I wrap up just with a summary and then see if anybody want to stick around for some chatting. Yeah, all of these slides are actually, all apart from like 2 maybe, are already available. So I'll just post that in the chat actually shortly. Someone's asking, do you think you can be Agile and work incrementally? Yeah, well, yes, we're always working incrementally. If we're following iterative incremental development, which is what Scrum's based on and most of the Agile methods are based on. So basically every time a small backlog item makes it to done and is integrated into the latest product, that's an increment. But the idea is that we're not just doing a feature, let's say, or some sort of capability once, and that's one shot and we never get a second chance. The whole idea of iteration is to give ourselves a second pass at it, maybe a third pass at it, if we can actually get more value by elaborating it, extending it, making it more flexible, enhancing it in some way. So it should not be just incremental. yes, it is incremental, but not just incremental. It's also iterative. Otherwise, we're missing a lot of the benefits of this sort of thing. Does that make sense, Ethan? See you, but I saw your question there. All right. So just to finish up, I guess one of the big insights is this customer collaboration over contract negotiation relates to internal people, not just external customers. And it doesn't just relate to when it says contract negotiation, client vendor contracts with lawyers involved and signing in blood on the dotted line necessarily. It's actually the way we set up the relationship between business people and expectations with development. Are they negotiating like a fairly fixed thing, or are they looking to roll up sleeves and actually collaborate, like it says there? And yeah, that traditional contract game really incentivizes people to follow a plan rather than respond to change. It's an interesting way to think of it. That creates an illusion of predictability, right? When you see that beautiful Gantt chart or the product roadmap, more likely, if we're trying to be trendy, you know, that it may well be a fiction, right? And it may not be the smartest thing to follow that, even if it was possible. There might be more valuable things we could be doing in August than what we know about when we put that plan together. And it leads to low agility, reduction in transparency and control. And commonly, if we can't actually do it the way we've planned it, then things will go wrong, and that tends to lead to people blaming each other and reduce trust, etc. So the good news is you can escape this, and I have seen it, especially, let me say, the environments I've seen it most is when it's not a project environment so much, with a start-stop project, which has been funded on the basis of you'll deliver this scope by that. It's more an ongoing product development environment where there is funding to continue forward product development, and then it's just a question of steering on the value side rather than the cost side, you know, because often that project budgeting, you know, gets people off on the side of let's agree a certain budget as a cost for it, with strings attached to what's going to be delivered for that money, rather than saying we're going to actively manage the value side along the way, which is a bit of a different mindset. The time I've seen it particularly, or the type of organization I've seen it particularly, is one where people, probably quite senior, even executives, have thought of what we're doing there as R&D. I can think of at least a couple where they call it research and development. And the way that they thought about it was, we're doing best if we actually do that in a sustainable way. In fact, that was probably the one thing I didn't cover that I really think we should just say. It's the separation of the development, that's right, it's down here. Development from external commitments. So I think that's probably the most important one to finish on. But Baz, really nice sentence here. He says, you assume that you're developing the fastest, or I'd say most healthily and best, when doing it sustainably, and thus ignoring commitments made. Is a fairly blunt way of putting it, right? So just the idea that you have a team or a set of teams that just are developing at a steady pace that they can actually do forever. So it's not so flat out that they're going to fall in a heap. And also they're building into that time and space to actually improve, to keep things healthy, to really, you know, sharpen the saw, right? Not just execute under pressure, and then not cutting corners. There is time to refactor. Just like one colleague I used to work with, I remember he spent a whole day, he said at the end of the day, hey, Rowan, I wrote no new lines of new functionality today. All I did was restructure the existing code and remove code. And he actually removed a considerable amount of code to simplify the system so it'll be more maintainable in the future. And he thought that is a good day at work, right? That was actually a really valuable thing for the team and the product. So yeah, that's that whole shielding from external commitments. I would see that as number one part of the product owner's role. Well, they'll be hearing about the stakeholders saying, I want this by X and you want that by Y. And they have that job of basically saying, let's look beyond that to the success of the product and the vision we've got and the product goal. Those sorts of things, and really trying to massage things into a backlog that then the team really see that view of the priorities rather than hear about the pressures that would have the developers perhaps cut corners and start not being sustainable. So I think the questions that we can all ask, like of individual developers even, how sustainable is this from your perception of it? Like the perceived pressure you feel like you're under, the pace we're going at, the amount of technical debt we're dealing with, you know, because if those things aren't so sustainable, then what can we do to make it more sustainable? And if we can just create that environment where people are working in a nice, healthy, sustainable pace, and then have something in between them and the wider world that actually mediates between the commitments and demands, and starts to maybe educate those stakeholders a little bit about how we can manage this from looking at where things are on the queue and the forecast and the trending. And then, yeah, we're starting to get into a healthier place for this, I think, and avoiding that contract game. All right, well, that's what I had for you tonight. I guess that was seemingly of interest. I'll stick around and chat with anyone that's interested in doing that. But thank you so much for joining this one.